Welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion of the age of religious wars. I want to talk about the Calvinists and the Catholics here for a moment. These are the two groups that are going to be at each other's throats here over the 16th and 17th centuries across Western Europe. I think we can do just kind of a survey and make some general statements so you get some idea of what's at stake here and sort of the values of the two sides. The Calvinists and the Catholics alike can be labeled conservative in the sense that they clung to the traditional medieval belief that no diversity could be tolerated within Christendom. To tolerate diversity is to encourage sin in the minds of medieval Europeans. We're not interested in your dissent or your personal opinion. We are interested in uniformity of religious belief. Remember, during this time, we have the age of exploration has started. We have expansion into Asia and into the Americas, North and South. Remember that we have emerging commercial capitalism developing here in Northwest Europe especially, which we'll talk about in more detail later. Remember now with the Reformation that we have emerging nationalism, emerging state sovereignty. Again, the notion of a kingdom based on Christianity is dissolving away. So we have individual states emerging from this idea, this fantasy, this illusion that Christendom could somehow be united. So the Calvinists and the Catholics harnessed these forces, these emerging nationalistic forces, for themselves. The Calvinist-Catholic struggle was, in a sense, the last medieval crusade, an internal crusade, a civil war among Christians in Europe. The Calvinist-Catholic conflict was the first modern war among nation-states in Europe. Nothing like it's been seen before or since. Looking at the Calvinist, you need to realize that one had to accept Calvin's concept of God's absolute and all-pervading power and of man's utter depravity. One had to accept the fact that man was incapable of fulfilling God's law as revealed in the Bible. The Calvinists had to believe that God chooses to save some few persons, not on their merits, because they have no merits, but solely by God's grace. These few people who are saved, of course, are the elect. We talked about this and we talked about Calvin and the Reformation earlier. The elect, those persons who accepted these premises, who abased themselves before God's will and experienced God's irresistible grace, knew that he was among the predestined elect or saints, the only true Christians. Despite Calvin's stress on human worthlessness, his church was an exclusive brotherhood which separated the saints from the sinners, the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Far from being fatalistic, the saints were intensely active. And this is very interesting. We've talked about this before. The Calvinists swore to obey and help enforce God's law. This covenant or contract, to which all agreed, easily came to serve as a kind of constitution binding the Calvinists in a political or military confederation against their worldly enemies. Armed with the Calvinist virtues of asceticism and industry, practical education, and moral responsibility, these Protestants were hard to suppress or to silence. Now, let's shift to the Catholics for a moment. On the Catholic side, the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, an order of priests founded in 1540 by St. Ignatius of Loyola, was almost equally determined and disruptive as the Calvinist on the other side. Calvin spoke contemptuously of the Jesuit and like dregs, unquote, but the resemblance between the Calvinist and the Jesuit is a fascinating one. Working from diametrically opposite religious principles, Loyola and Calvin each built a select, cohesive, extroverted band of zealots, religious zealots. St. Ignatius's Jesuits devised an intellectual discipline for the members of his society. The Jesuits, a highly autocratic, semi-militaristic organization, very devout, highly motivated. The Jesuits are directly responsible to the Pope. The Jesuits established hundreds of schools to teach the boys of the elite, especially upper-class boys, how to define and defend the authoritative dogmas of the Catholic Church. To the Protestants, Jesuits became a curse word for the crafty intrigues and immoral tactics sponsored by these devilish priests. At mid-century, subtle but crucial, religious and political changes took place. With the death of John Calvin in 1564, the initial creative work of the Protestant Reformation was completed. Correspondingly, with the death of St. Ignatius of Loyola in 1556 and the termination of the Council of Trent, which we talked about as part of the Counter-Reformation, in 1563, the Catholic internal reform program was also spent. Now, I want to spend a moment here talking about the Inquisition. We've mentioned it earlier when we talked about the Counter-Reformation. Let's talk about it here in this context of the Catholics and the Calvinists. The Roman Inquisition and the Index of Prohibited Books helped to protect the faithful from Protestant propaganda. The Spanish Inquisition, dating from 1478, had been designed to root out heresy among converted Muslims and Jews. Those converted were generally hated and feared. And by the time of Philip II, a racist campaign had been launched to bar anyone from public office associated with these pagan conversions. The Inquisition went to extraordinary lengths to keep the Protestant heresy out of Spain. Extraordinary lengths. St. Ignatius of Loyola himself was twice imprisoned by the Spanish Inquisition on suspicion of heresy. Can you imagine? Here a man has devoted his life to the defense of the Catholic Church and is twice imprisoned. Like every other prince of his day, Philip, the King of Spain, was jealous of outside interference with his church. And besides, quote, in his heart he considered religion too serious a matter to be left up to the Pope, unquote. Anyone deviating in the slightest particular from Catholic orthodoxy, and you'll remember orthodoxy, the right way to think or the right way to believe, was branded a Lutheran by the Holy Office, subjected to torture and secret trial, and if found guilty and stubborn in his heresy, would be handed over to secular authorities for public execution, what we call an auto de fe, or an act of faith, to be burned alive, instead of recanting one's heresy. Now, I'm going to end this lecture by discussing just for a moment the divine right of kings. This is the notion that the king is appointed by God, or his rule is sanctioned by God. It was necessary to devise a new quasi-religious doctrine of absolutism in order to answer the Jesuits and the Calvinists. The doctrine which resulted is known as the divine right theory of kingship. According to this theory, God appoints the secular sovereign as God's earthly lieutenant and invests the king with absolute power over his subjects. God has absolute power over the king has absolute power over his earthly subjects. The king has no obligations to obey the laws and customs of his state. Instead, the king is answerable to God alone. Even if he rules tyrannically, he's still God's lieutenant, for God has placed him on the throne to punish the people's sins, and their only recourse is to pray for the King's mercy, and for God's grace. So we're going to end this little discussion here on the Calvinists and the Catholics. And in our next discussion, we'll talk about, we're going to do a kind of a survey of Eastern and Central European states during this time of the age of religious wars. Thank you.